Hello and welcome to the fifth video in this series of videos on the whole Bible survey. And this is a video on Leviticus. Now, if you're like I used to be, your first thought might be, Leviticus? What's there to talk about in Leviticus? I used to read a chapter a day in the King James Version, and let me say, when I got to Leviticus, there was a real temptation to slow down in reading a chapter a day. But Leviticus actually is a very rich book of the Old Testament. And if you've never looked at it, you might wander through it a little bit. It starts off talking about different kinds of sacrifices, but more on that in a moment. Leviticus is a fascinating book, and I feel like the more you know about it, the more fascinating it becomes. But I want to start with this case study from Leviticus. I've just taken verses from Leviticus, and I want to go through several of these verses. Let's just look at some of the verses in Leviticus. Do not wear clothing of mixed material. Well, frankly, I think this is cotton. But polyester is a clothing of mixed thread. And so anybody who wears polyester is I suppose, technically in violation of the book of Leviticus. What's up with that? Rise in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly. Well, I hope I show respect for the elderly, but frankly, I've not paid much attention to this verse. I haven't stood up when my mother comes into the room, or when an elderly person comes into the room. I don't stand up. Is this something that we need to start doing it again? It's in Leviticus, right? What do you think? Do not take any loan interest of any kind from your countrymen. From your person who lives where you live, your fellow American. Don't take any loans. Does this mean that the banking business is intrinsically immoral? Because banking is, can Christians not be in banking? Or a good godly person can't be involved in banking of any kind? And of course, there have been some people who've talked about managing your money and so forth, and have said, don't ever take a loan out. There are people who do this with churches. They will never take a loan out in a building program on the basis of passages like this. What about this one? I'm sorry, a little awkward. Do not have sex with a woman during the uncleanness of her menstrual cycle. I'm not even going to talk about that one. I'm just going to move right on. Love your neighbors yourself. Okay, wait a minute. Don't wear polyester and love your neighbors yourself. It's a little surprising, isn't it? That when Jesus is asked in Matthew 22, what is the great commandment? He says, love God, love neighbor. And where does the love neighbor come from? It comes from Leviticus, of all places. And alongside of do not take interest and don't put any tattoo marks on yourself. It's really kind of an in thing right now for people to have Christian tattoos. I've had people consult me on Hebrew tattoos that they want to put on their arms and such like that. Our tattoos, we're violating the Bible when we get a tattoo. By the way, I have no interest in tattoos. Do not lie with a man as a man lies with a woman. This is one of two key passages in the Old Testament. The other one's also in Leviticus 20 and Leviticus 18. Those are the two key passages that prohibit at least male homosexual sex. Do not lie with a man as a man lies with a woman. It's in Leviticus. We have don't wear polyester. We have don't take loan interest. We have don't have tattoos. And then we have love your neighbors yourself and don't have homosexual sex. So how do we decide? I'm not done with the list yet, but the question is because there may be some, but most of us consider, I think this is true, right? Christians would consider some of these more important than others. Some of these, like don't wear clothing of mixed material, our response is, what's that all about? And that's probably part of the ceremonial law that Christians don't have to do anymore. That when Jesus came, that we're not bound by the ceremonial law. But yet do not lie with a man as a man lies with a woman. Certainly, I think the majority of Christians would say that is a timeless principle. Not all Christians think that's a timeless principle, but I think the majority of Christians would say that's timeless. And clearly, love your neighbors yourself is along with love God, one of the two big absolute ethical truths of Christianity. And so how do we decide? Don't shave the edges of your beard. Okay, now we're back to, I can't have a goatee. I can't have a mustache. I can't have long sideburns. How do we decide? Here's another one. Distinguish between clean and unclean animal. Be holy, for I am holy. And it is interesting, as we'll see in a minute, that being holy in the book of Leviticus is not associated with being godly. Being holy is associated in Leviticus with eating the right kinds of food and not eating the wrong kinds of food, like not eating pork. Be holy, don't eat pork. I mean, I'm not a big pork chop fan, but I've had it. I've had some pork chops. Father, forgive me, for I've sinned. I've had a pork chop. I mean, or is that a sin anymore? Or is it a sin for Gentiles? And it's a sin for Jews and not a sin for Gentiles? The bottom line here is there must be some method that we're using. Maybe we haven't fully talked about it. Maybe we haven't fully articulated it before, but there must be some reason why we as Christians today consider some of these absolutely essential, love your neighbors yourself, and others of them, well, that's just the ceremonial law. Don't shave the edges of your beard. How do we decide which is binding and which isn't? This is a hermeneutical question. This word hermeneutics is going to come up throughout this series of videos. And the last video is basically a kind of, what have we learned about hermeneutics here? This question of how do we know how to apply the Bible to today? And the book of Leviticus brings this out in full force, really. Well, let's dig into the actual content of Leviticus, shall we? So it starts off with 5 basic sacrifices. Interestingly, not all the sacrifices had to do with sin. That was a big surprise to me once upon a time. I just assumed that sacrifice is always about sin. But you can do sacrifices. There's a peace offering, peace sacrifice, where it's about getting along with other people, a fellowship. There's a fellowship offering. There's a Thanksgiving sacrifice. Basically, we bring the sacrifice of praise. You know, you're offering an animal, yes, but sometimes there's a grain offering, though. It can also be a grain offering would tend to be more the Thanksgiving sacrifice, but a sacrifice that's basically saying, thank you, Lord. There are really, there's a whole burnt offering that where the whole animal is consumed. That's something I didn't understand for a very long time. I just assumed that all sacrifices were, you know, the whole thing's gone. But actually, the majority of sacrifices were a kind of a sharing a meal with God. God gets the fat, and then some of the meat goes to the priests, and then some of the meat goes to the family offering the sacrifice. And so that'll come into play when we get to the New Testament. There's also a guilt offering and a sin offering. Those two obviously have to do with sin and so forth. By the way, most of the sacrifices of the Old Testament are not oriented around intentional sin. This is very interesting when you dig into Numbers and into Leviticus, that the sacrifices really were more about unintentional wrongdoing and unintentional uncleanness and things like that. There isn't a lot of space in Leviticus or Numbers for getting forgiveness for intentional sin. We know that it could happen because David sins intentionally and he gets forgiven. And so we certainly know that there is the possibility of forgiveness for intentional sin, but that's not really the way the sacrificial system is oriented. The sacrificial system is primarily oriented toward unintentional wrongdoing and so forth. This is part, again, of getting into the worldview of the Old Testament and in its place in the ancient Near East. In Leviticus, Aaron, Moses' brother, is installed as the very first high priest. Moses is not the first high priest. Aaron, his brother, is the first high priest. We read in chapter 11 of Leviticus about holiness codes with regard to eating. No pork, if something's in the water, it should have fins and scales. So something like an eel, that's unclean. A bird should be able to fly. And so something like an ostrich, that's unclean. If it's on the ground, it should have legs. It shouldn't slither. If you're a snake, unclean. And then, of course, blood. Blood does not belong outside. Blood belongs inside. And again, it's very interesting that in chapter 11, as we saw in, I think it was chapter 20 in my previous slide, Be holy, for I am holy is connected with the food laws. Very interesting, because I made the claim in the previous video that holiness in the Old Testament is primarily about being set apart to God. It's not primarily about moral purity in the way that, say, the New Testament focuses more on moral purity in relation to holiness. Holiness in the Old Testament is about being attached to God, connected to God, belonging to God. And if something is associated with God, then or magnetized by God or plugged in. I think of Guardians of the Galaxy, where at the very end, the first movie, where they've have the stone and it's just too much energy for one person. And so they touch each other and then the energy spreads out. And holiness is contagious. Defilement is contagious, but holiness is also contagious in the ancient worldview of the Jews and of the Israelites. I wanted to mention a work by an anthropologist by the name of Mary Douglas, who wrote a book called Purity and Danger decades ago. But I wanted to mention her way of looking at these holiness codes. Again, not everybody agrees with her. But I like what she says because it's a glimpse of how we should expect the worldview of the ancient Jews to be different from ours. In fact, I've developed a kind of suspiciousness that if I read a biblical text and it fits a little too nicely into my culture today, say Western American culture, if I read the Bible and it just fits a little too easy, even with my denomination, boy, that's just a little too conveniently Wesleyan, or that's just a little bit too conveniently American. And I begin to get suspicious because you see the ancient world, whether it be the ancient Near East of the Old Testament or the ancient Mediterranean of the New Testament, it was a different world than us. It was far different from me going to Africa today. If I go to Africa today, I might be struck by, wow, especially if I go to upcountry, I may be struck by, wow, this is a completely different world than mine. But you have to realize that the biblical worlds were much closer to the world of say, third world India. That world is much closer to the world of the Bible than my middle class white American world. And so when the Bible is just a little too convenient and comfortable for my culture, I should at least have a question mark. I wonder if I'm reading my assumptions into it a little bit. So when it comes, for example, to the food laws, it's really convenient for us to say, well, this is all about health. This is all about hygiene. This is all about trichinosis in liver or in pork. And so the reason, this makes a lot of sense to us. The reason why God prohibited pork is because there could be diseases that you could get from pork. But that's that fits very well into our way of thinking about things in our culture. I shouldn't expect everything in the Bible to come out the way my culture thinks. And what Mary Douglas suggests is that in these prohibitions, we're seeing something more profoundly different from our culture than we have a point of reference. So, for example, pork involves pigs, and certain people groups tend pigs. Well, the Israelites did not tend pigs; they tended sheep. The Israelites were shepherds. In fact, when we read Genesis very soon, you'll notice that when Jacob and his family go down to Egypt, they're not allowed to live around the other Egyptians because they're shepherds. And there's this great verse that says, and shepherds were detestable to the Egyptians. So you see, culture's lined up like that. I'm an Israelite, I'm a shepherd. You're an Egyptian, or you're a Philistine, you herd pigs. And because Philistines and Israelites weren't friends, therefore pig herders and sheep don't get along. And so not eating pork is, at least on one level, an expression of the fact that Israelites are a different people than Philistines are. And it goes beyond that because Philistines worship different gods than the Israelites worship. And so eating pork is akin to defiling yourself with other gods. This is difficult for us to get our head around. because, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, of course it doesn't make any sense, because you're a modern American, maybe if you're listening to this video, and you're in your culture. Doesn't make any sense, but that wasn't your culture. It was the ancient Near East. It's a completely different world than the world in which we are. By the way, in the parable of the prodigal son, where he goes off and he finds himself taking care of pigs, well, my immediate reaction is, ooh, pigs, muddy, dirty, yucky. But that pigs were, this guy has left Israel, he's left the building. This guy is in a foreign people. He has left his people for foreign people, and therefore he has left his God for other gods. These are all the implications of the parable of the prodigal son, just by the mention of pigs. Or even when the Gerasene demoniac is dwelling, the demons go into pigs. This tells us that Jesus is no longer in Israel territory when he's with the Gerasenes and so forth. Now, birds that don't fly, fish that don't have fins, things on the ground that slither. This, I would argue, has to do with the way Israelites process the world. That I call it kind theology. That certain kinds of things belong in certain kinds of places. So birds, that's a category, and things that are birds should be able to fly. Things in the sea, that's a certain category, and things that are in the sea should have fins and scale. Things on the land should have legs, and if something doesn't have a leg, then it's not clean. So you see that the uncleanness of a lot of these has to do with playing out a particular Israelite worldview, a worldview we find in Genesis 1, right, where God creates everything after its kind. There are kinds of things. Things go a certain way, and they don't go other ways. That's part of the Israelite worldview at that time, at least. I think that's probably largely lost by the time Jesus comes to earth, which is why it's so easy for the New Testament to say we're no longer under the food laws. And of course, this is, we were talking about how do we find out when to apply things and when not to apply things? Well, the number one way to know whether to apply something or not is by what the New Testament says about it, because the New Testament gives us the kind of complete understanding, or at least the lenses through which we should read the Old Testament. And Mark 7 says that Jesus declared all foods clean. And Paul says in Romans 14, some people have this conviction, other people have this conviction. The key is that you be fully convinced in your own mind. So clearly the New Testament does not consider the food laws to be timeless, but the New Testament relegates the food laws of Israel to that particular moment in Israelite history. Blood is interesting also in its own way. Blood, probably we think of blood a little bit differently than they thought of blood. There's a verse in Leviticus that says the life is in the blood. And so the blood, I think that if we think of blood in their worldview as a kind of nuclear power source, something like that when the high priest goes into the most holy place on the Day of Atonement with blood and smears the blood on the Ark of the Covenant, it's like powering it up. Not literally, but I'm trying to come up with a metaphor to help us get out of our assumptions and our worldview and things that make sense to us and begin to get into the ancient Israelite worldview. But power definitely belonged inside. And so blood is like out of control power. We've got a nuclear problem here. Everybody, let's set up a 5-mile radius around this nuclear power plant that's gone critical. Put on a hazmat suit. Because we got radiation leak here. If you think of blood that is outside of the body as a radiation leak, I really think that's a kind of analogy to begin to understand why Leviticus prohibits. But you can see it is a very different worldview. And one of the principles that I'm going to develop in this series of videos is that when God reveals God's self to us, God uses categories that make sense to us. He meets us where we're at, and then he moves us on from there. And so one of the things, of course, when we talk about sacrifices, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament says that Christ's sacrifice is the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. In fact, the book of Hebrews tells us that none of these sacrifices in the Old Testament were actually effective to take away sins. that they were like a rain check, or they were like a foreshadowing of the one effective sacrifice. And the one effective sacrifice of all time is Christ's death on the cross. And so these are all shadowy illustrations, as Hebrews puts it. They're foreshadowings. And you can see, again, there's different ways of thinking about the sacrifices of the Old Testament. One is that there is some fundamental principle involved with the sacrifice, but not contradicting that is also the idea that everybody's offering sacrifices in that world, and so God meets them where they're at, and God he starts with the sacrifices they're doing, and then eventually, at the right time, he says, you know what, we don't need those animal sacrifices anymore. Well, that's a train of thought we'll continue on as we go through the course. There's also legislation or instruction in Leviticus on skin diseases. We have a number of interesting ceremonies, one involving a red heifer. Well, they take a red heifer and they burn it up, and then they take the ashes of the red heifer and put it in water, and they sprinkle it on a person who's unclean. There's another similar kind of sprinkling using hyssop. Very interesting. Probably in terms of physics and chemistry, it doesn't work, but again, not all of the cleansing is scientific. That clean and unclean is not. It's a little like cooties or the 5-second rule. You know, is that piece of meat that you dropped on the floor, is it really definitely unclean after 5 seconds and it was clean at 4 seconds? Or is that just something, it's a way we process the world. It's a way we draw lines around the world. And so some of the cleansing from skin diseases was not scientific cleansing. Again, we have a scientific worldview, a lot of us. That's not the biblical worldview is not thinking materialistically or scientifically. We'll talk about that when we get to Genesis 1. Is Genesis 1 really primarily about material creation, or is it about the ordering of creation? We'll talk about that soon enough. So I've already mentioned the Day of Atonement, chapter 16 of Leviticus. We'll also, I think we come across it again in Numbers as well. But there are 2 goats. There's one goat that unfortunately dies. So that is the sacrificial goat in that sense. But there's another goat that we sometimes call the scapegoat. There's another goat that the high priest pronounces the corporate sins of Israel. This is another thing. We're very individualistic in our culture. Israel was much more of a corporate or collectivist kind of culture. And so the high priest pronounces the sins of Israel committed in ignorance, by the way, also. If you go through this chapter, you'll see that this chapter is all about the sins of Israel, collective, their group sins, and their ignorance sins. They're laid on the scapegoat, and the scapegoat is let go out of the camp into the wilderness. It's kind of like a transference of all the sin of Israel onto the goat, and then the goat is sent away, and the sins go away with the goat. It's fascinating stuff. There was a movie, I think it was called The Green Mile. One of the characters in the movie could absorb the sickness of somebody by touching them. And that's an image that helps me kind of get a handle of what's happening here with the scapegoat. The sins are transferred into the goat, and then the goat is sent away. Rules on sex. So if you want to know what the New Testament means by sexual immorality, the Greek word in the New Testament is porneia. If you want to know what that means, I think probably see Leviticus 18. This is another one where, when we're wanting to know, how do I know what goes forward and what is limited to the Old Testament? Most of these are not mentioned in the New Testament. The ones that are really, let me look through here. Which ones are mentioned in the New Testament? 2 of them are mentioned in the New Testament. So I do not lie with a man as a man lies with a woman. That's from chapter 18 of Leviticus. That's mentioned in Romans 1. It's alluded to in 1 Corinthians 6 and in 1 Timothy 1. Love your neighbors yourself is clearly, along with love God, one of the key ethical things in the New Testament. And so my sense is that whenever the New Testament mentions something from Leviticus 18, it considers it to still be in force. This is something we'll talk about soon enough when we get to the New Testament, but we're going to kind of track that issue along as we go. But Leviticus 18 has rules on sexual practice. prohibitions on incest, prohibitions on having sex with animals, and so forth. Actually, I have a verse. I think I have that verse up here in a second as well. And then we have love your neighbor, which the New Testament and Jesus, not just Jesus, but Paul and others basically say that is the center of all of God's expectations of humanity. Love God, love neighbor. We have a couple of other festivals that are mentioned in our previous video on the Ten Commandments and the Book of the Covenant in Exodus. We mentioned the 3 festivals where Jewish males had to appear before the Lord: Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. We hear about 2 other festivals in Leviticus: the Festival of Trumpets and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was associated with Passover. So you have the day of Passover, and then you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread following on it. Year of Jubilee, this was a year every 50 years where the reset button was hit on land property for Israel. So let's say that somewhere in the course of a 50-year period, your grandfather loses the land. Well, according to theory, that land would be restored to you every 50 years. Now, we don't actually have any evidence that this was generally practiced, which is, again, very interesting. It may be more of a position paper than something that actually happened in the history of Israel. We just don't have evidence of it happening, which is fascinating. But it clearly implies a different worldview than we have. You know, we have a very mobile society. We have a very capitalistic society, you know, and so, you know, if you lost your land, you know, that's either your problem or your mistake or whatever. But there is a permanence to a person's connection to the land, at least in theory, in Israelite thinking. Poverty, or to be poor in the worldview of ancient Israel, is basically to be knocked off of track, basically to be knocked off of your inherited status. And the year of Jubilee was meant to restore everybody back to where they were before. Again, I don't know that that actually happened, but again, it's this idea that that there should be a common baseline, as it were, that we return to every 50 years. Well, this is, I think, the last slide, and this is because this is such a big issue today. I put the verse before it because some would argue that this context of a man not lying with a man as a man lies with a woman, some would say that the context of that is actually pagan temples. So some would say that this verse is about male prostitution, that the context of a male not lying with a man as a man lies with a woman, that the context of this in Leviticus 18 is a pagan temple where male prostitution would have been part of the worship of that other god, whatever he was, I assume. So you will not give him your seed to cause him to be offered to Molech. This is another god, god of the Moabites, I think. And you will not profane the name of your God. I'm Yahweh. You will not lie with a male like lying with a woman. It is abomination. You will not lie with a beast. Now, I'm just going to say it's difficult to know what the context of this verse is. Most Christians take this as a freestanding verse, take it as a timeless principle. A man should not lie with a man as a man lies with a woman. Most Christians take it that way. But we really don't have context for it, right? It's in a series of sexual prohibitions. And so there is debate between those who would say, no, there's something else going on here. It's not just a blanket prohibition. And again, historically, Christians have said, no, this is a timeless expectation. Well, okay, this has been the video on the book of Leviticus. You never knew Leviticus could be so fascinating. I mean, really, when you really dig into Leviticus, it's a fascinating, fascinating book. So we move on in our journey through the whole Bible survey.